proud to start with our acting dean of Arts and Sciences, John Perret, and we'll have him come up and give a welcome.
I don't normally get to talk much about peace, so I thought I'd take just a couple of minutes and tell you what I've been puzzling over as a way of introducing the day. I've been thinking a lot about the innocence of Islam. If you've seen, you've obviously been reading the news and know about the riots that have been happening worldwide. If you see the trailer, it's about a 14-minute trailer on YouTube, which is very, very cheesy. And from an American perspective, you wonder how on earth could this very poorly produced bit of propaganda have that kind of effect around the world, and what does this have to do with peace? Well, let me just give a few dimensions here that are happening. First, to our knowledge, this movie was produced by a Coptic Christian from, obviously from Egypt. The Coptics have been persecuted there for generations, and so here's a person who has immigrated, basically a forced immigration, if you will, because of the persecution the person has experienced there in Egypt. The person then comes to the United States where he wants retribution. And for retribution, he produces a movie about the Prophet Muhammad that is absolutely disparaging. And so makes a movie that is offensive. It's aesthetically offensive. It's certainly religiously offensive. Then he plays into the hands of the Salafists. The Salafists are trying to whip up any kind of emotion that they can so that they can gain power in the Middle East. And so here is a bit of here's a movie that's coming out of the United States. It plays into the hands of the Salafists because they can say this is one more example of anti-Islamic behavior, and they give a whole list from the United States invading 2 Islamic countries, to the United States continuing to support what looks like the persecution of Palestinians, which has been going on for several generations now. We have drone strikes in sovereign territory of the Palestinian country, and we can go on and on and on. And now look at the movie coming out. 31 people have died because of this to date. So we have persecution, we have retribution, we have exploitation, all set against the backdrop of violence and misunderstanding. Never, for this reason, I would say never have peace studies been more important than they are today. So welcome to this day of peace. I hope that the conversations will bear fruit. We definitely need it.
Thank you, Dr. Perret. I am Sharon Moran, Director of the Peace Program here at the University. It's Violence Prevention Intervention Program. And this morning I have the honor of introducing Dr. Russ Vandenbroucke. When I first came to the university, I heard Dr. Vandenbroucke, Russ Vandenbroucke, before I met him, he doesn't know this, but before I met him, I heard about him so much from his position on helping women. That was the program that I had. So I was very interested to meet him. I had the honor of working with him on this peace studies, trying to get the program together. And so I really feel like he's an example of somebody who not only talks the talk, but walks the walk. And so if you look in your program, you get to see that his title of his program today is called A Window to Our World. And if you look through his credits there, you'll see that each of the arts and theater programs that he has designed are all the intersections of race, ethnicity, international relations. He worked with people with Bangkok, Eleanor Roosevelt, looking at gender, atomic bombers with Hiroshima, the Brown versus the Board of Education, and then the young Americans in Iraq. So Window to Our World is a very good example of what he's going to talk about. He's got the experience of looking at it from a broad-based spectrum. So we are so pleased to welcome Dr. Russ Vandenbroucke.
I'm going to speak from the middle of the room because I am a theater guy. And I'll start with this little anecdote. When I came to the university, I taught a big lecture class. My son was in college at the time, and I said, Justin, I understand you've had some really good classes with a lot of people. And he said, yeah, Dad, yeah, I did. And I said, do you have any suggestions about things that would help that I can apply in my class? He said, yeah, Dad, I had some really good ones. Tell me this, what time does the class start? I said, 9 a.m., Justin. And he said, oh, forget it. So thank you for being here at 9 a.m. The music that some of you heard coming in was Woody Guthrie. And it's a centennial, and last night, Dr. Harding talked about the importance of using music. And so I wanted to play a little of his music, and I think we all know This Land Is Your Land. I'm going to go backwards one slide. That's a very familiar lyric that you know. This land is your land, this land is my land. You probably don't know this verse. My pointer isn't too... You probably don't know this verse where he talks about seeing people in line at the relief office and turns this land is your land into a question. Is this land your land and mine? And I not only got that idea from Dr. Harding last night, but what I'm going to do this morning for about the next half hour before I shift into something else is completely different from what I planned. I had an idea when I was taking a shower yesterday to use a somewhat different approach. And although I'm going to cover a variety of subjects, you're going to see that it's much more personal than I think I've ever shared except with friends. And there's an old idea from my era in the 1960s that the personal is political and the political is personal. So for about the next 30 minutes, I'm going to lead us into a way of looking at peace studies and a way of seeing that as a window to the world through some images and some stories. And I hope that along the way you will see that there is a macro dimension, a very large dimension to this topic. There's a very personal and micro aspect, and one intermediate between groups of people. And at the end, I'll take a few minutes specifically to talk about why the program is what it is at U of L, and I have a little parable that I'll tell you. So here's one way of looking at the world. We've seen this image from space. And here's another one that takes us a little bit closer. And that too is a way of looking at our world. But I basically think of peace studies as a window. It's a frame, it's a lens through which we can look at everything. But windows go in two directions, don't they? We can look out of a window, but we can also look in through a window into ourselves. And from that micro dimension to this very vast and macro dimension, I think are many of the places where this subject intersects. Here's the simplest explanation I have come up with yet. Conflict is permanent and universal. We have it in our classrooms sometimes, we have it in our families, we have it in our neighborhoods, and yes, we have it in nations. Nothing wrong with conflict. You could say we're having conflict with the election now between two ideologies and ways of looking at the world. Conflict can be very creative, can be very healthy. But it's negative when it turns into violence. And so it seems to me that what peace studies does is to understand not just the dynamics that create conflict, and there are repeated dynamics across countries, across people, that suggest when conflict can lead to violence. So my first story, and the other thing I'm going to try to do today, in addition to discussing peace studies in very broad terms, is to try to use some of the topics of last night and today for these personal stories that I'm going to tell you. So it's a little bit of a preview as well, and I hope to suggest what all of the connections might be. And first I'm going back to this word omnidisciplinary. I think I made it up. I think it's a neologism. And I got it from reading a book or an essay, I think by Johann Galtung, but it might have been someone else, who used the term omnicide. We've all heard of parricide and regicide and fratricide. And I suddenly saw this word omnicide, which indeed has happened over, if you compare the First World War, say, to current war, where we had people lined up, you know, in the First World War, and 90% of the casualties were with combatants. But now most casualties are civilians. There's been this flip, and so he used the word omnicide, that everyone can be killed in war. And so I sort of adopted that to the idea that peace studies is omnidisciplinary. So here we have an image of Martin Luther King giving a speech that many of you might not know at Riverside Church on April 4th, 1967, exactly to the day, a year before he was assassinated. It's a speech in which he came out publicly against the Vietnam War, and you can see this quote at the bottom, in which he saw a connection between civil rights and foreign policy, and also asserted that he thought he believed he lived in the most violent nation on earth. Pretty extraordinary statement. And here we have a picture of a young man in ROTC. And in 1967, when he gave that speech, I was not in ROTC. But the next year I was. And I agreed to go to Vietnam if ordered to do so. And indeed began basic training 2 months after he was assassinated in April in Fort Benning, Georgia. And I was in for 28 days. And somewhere along the line, maybe in the 14th or the 17th day, there was a lecture by the drill sergeant on chemical and biological warfare, in which he explained the effects of botulism and anthrax and mustard gas and all sorts of terrible agents. And he ended his little description to about 20 of us by saying, this is the summer of 1968, June, July of 1968. So more than a year after King has said he lives in the most violent nation on earth, I'm listening to a lecture on chemical and biological warfare, at the end of which the sergeant said, you may think that all of these are outlawed by the Geneva Conventions. But guess what? We have never ratified those conventions. And in that moment, I started to become a conscientious objector, a person who refused to participate in war. And it's true that those conventions that came out of the First World War were not then ratified by the United States, but they were in 1974 under Nixon. But I guess the story of that little juxtaposition of slides is that when I was the age of many people in this audience, I was willing to go to Vietnam. I was willing to bear arms. I was willing to continents killing other human beings. And I was still in college, and so maybe I had an opportunity to use my education to learn something that had changed my life. Maybe this program can fit in ways to change your life. Later today, Acting Dean Duncan from the law school is going to talk about restorative justice. And here we have two images from South Africa. So part of my story is about traveling. The first one is an image from Fort Benning. I was in Georgia. And I was in South Africa in, I believe it was 2003. And for the first time, saw in person Bishop Tutu. Here he's sort of in a pinkish lavender. What color would we call this cassock that he's wearing? Fuchsia. The day I saw him, he was in purple. And he was in an audience a little bigger than this, maybe twice the size of it, but not that much bigger. And it was a literary conference. It was at the Grahamstown Arts Festival. He was actually promoting a book, but he happened to be there. And he used the term restorative justice, which I had never heard of before. I'd certainly heard of retributive justice, of the American justice system. People do something wrong, they're tried, if they're convicted, they have a punishment. But I'd never heard of the idea of restorative justice, which is focused more on the victims of injustice than it is on the people who perpetrate. And he was speaking specifically in the aftermath of the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was installed after the end of apartheid to deal with history, to have a series of inquiries in which people could testify about what they experienced, both as victims, but also as perpetrators, whether they were thugs or policemen or members of the military. And in that talk, Bishop Tutu talked about the healing that resulted from this TRC process. And I don't for a minute want to suggest that everything in South Africa is now great and perfect. But it was an extraordinary time to be in that country after Mandela had been released from Robben Island, and that an entire country attempted to deal with its history by confronting it openly, sharing the truth of what had happened on both sides, those who helped to sustain the apartheid system and those who long fought to bring it down, and to try to have some sense of restoration that resulted from it. And after this talk, Bishop Tutu led a march to this particular church, which is a cathedral in Grahamstown. Grahamstown is a traditionally English-speaking enclave, so as opposed to the Afrikaners who are Dutch descended. And there was a sort of march of a couple hundred people that I was able to participate in. And I'll actually read something that occurred along the way. Bishop Tutu said, "We are all surprised that the transition was as disciplined as it was. We did not go for retribution. People think there is only one kind of justice, but there is restorative justice besides retributive justice." And answering some questions at this arts festival, he said, "Around the world, people think just because you're South African, you can help them. In the Middle East, Northern Ireland, Cambodia, they say to us, 'How did you do this?'" Now, this is 2004. "How did you do this?" It was at a very great price, he said. And turning to a global perspective, he noted, "We spend billions on the military. If we spent a minute fraction of this, every child in the world would have enough to eat and clean water to drink." Amen, Tom. Not from Bishop Tutu, but from Joshua Goldstein. Every family in the United States spent $700 supporting the military and $2 supporting UN peacekeeping missions. Think about that ratio. Back to South Africa. So he led a procession of writers, artists, lay people. It included people whose spouses were murdered during the apartheid era, whose children had no fathers. Their testimony had been integral to the continuing process of reconciliation. And we got to the church to remind the congregants that many people in our country with pain and hurt could have turned that pain into revenge, but they did not. And as extraordinary as it was to participate in a public event led by a Nobel Peace Prize winner, it was not the most memorable part of that afternoon. Rather, in this cathedral, one of the speakers was a woman named Jean Fourie, a mother of a victim of the apartheid era, a white woman of English descent. 9 winters ago, she said, the police burst in and my daughter died. She was killed during the final days of apartheid in a famous event at a Heidelberg tavern. Some years later, she encountered the commander who had ordered that raid that led to the massacre, that included the murder of her daughter. That commander had written a book, and the mother went to attend a book signing by this man. And they reconciled. And this man wrote a poem for Linda, the daughter who had been murdered. And Jean Foray said, my feminine return to the Cody strength leaves me at this moment. And she said, this citadel, this church, is a remnant of that of my ancestors, my English-speaking ancestors, who came here in 1820, did my family. Forgive me for what my ancestors did. She had in mind specifically the Anglo-Boer War at the turn of the 19th century. Forgive me for what we did to the Afrikaners. We all must fight the ghosts of our past. No TRC, no Truth and Reconciliation Commission can do that for us. And at the end of this service, I thought about some famous words from a novel some of you may know by Alan Paton called Cry the Beloved Country, which I believe was published in 1948, the very same year that was the start, legally, of apartheid in South Africa. And at the end of that book, a friend of the central character, Reverend Khumalo, says to him, I have one great fear. These are black men talking to each other. One talking to a minister. I have one great fear in my heart, that one day when they turn to loving, that when they turn to loving, meaning the white people, they will find that we have turned to hating. Clearly, that was not the case with Jean Foray, despite the murder of her daughter. And they're using this occasion to reminisce about her ancestors who persecuted the Afrikaners, one of whose descendants was the commander who ordered what became that massacre at the tavern. The personal is political, and the political is personal. We'll hear about a different kind of restorative justice here in Louisville with adolescents, but that's an important international example. Later this morning, we're going to be joined by Dr. Arno from Metro Louisville Health and Wellness. And I share with you 2 images. Anyone guess what Martin Luther King is holding there? Can you see? Kind of medal, famous medal he won. Any takers on a famous medal Martin Luther King won? Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. Anyone care to guess who this is? 1901 is the first awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize. And Jean-Henri Durand, I probably mispronounced his name, was the founder of the International Red Cross. And he received the very first Peace Prize. But there was a big controversy after it was awarded. Some of you may know that Henry Kissinger was part of another controversy, I think in 73 or 4, when he got the Nobel Peace Prize. But at the very first ceremony, there was concern that this man who had founded the Red Cross was receiving a Peace Prize. Now that may seem anomalous to you. How could someone, the Red Cross, blood donations, helping people, fixing wounds, Florence Nightingale, what's the problem here? Well, the Red Cross at that time, as with other organizations, used a system in dealing with those who were wounded on the battlefield, that those who were least wounded were cared for first, so that they could return to battle and be more successful as combatants. And that was the nature of the conflict. Why should we reward an organization that is in a position that actually is extending the role of the military and allowing individuals to return to the fight? Now there's another little sub-story that I would like to suggest from this image, which is in those 63 years that distinguish them. We have a very much different image of what peace is. With the Red Cross and this Red Cross story, with this military story, we're thinking of peace in a sort of conventional sense of, oh, there's peace on the one hand and there's war on the other. But through time, through these last century, the sense of what peace is has broadened and broadened. It's part of why I like to use the word only disciplinary. And we see here a man receiving it for his work with civil rights. We know in our own lifetimes that Al Gore shared the Peace Prize for his work with global warming. That's a long way from the idea of war and peace having to do with diplomats and creating accords and ceasefires. Those still exist, but there's been a shift. I would call it a broadening of what it means to make peace. Here's another image about violence and public health. You see the Louisville Hospital, of course, and a hammer. And 2 nights ago at the West War Talk, I met a man who, I didn't meet him, I had a conversation with a man who's in one of the plays at U of L. He's in Much Ado About Nothing. Andre. And he told me about a case here in Louisville, so now I'm going to tell you a very local story, where he was standing near Humana down on Main Street and saw a police car going very fast down the street, and he waved to the policeman and suggested that he slow down. I'm telling you Andre's version of what happened. And the police car came to a screeching stop, told him to put his hands up, eventually handcuffed him, threw him in the back of the car. 3 other police cars arrived, and there were various citations, summonses, and now I guess there is a civil case going forward. And I only tell you his side because that's just a story that I heard 36 hours ago. And he explained an injury he had. He broke his nose when he was put in the back seat of the car. One of the other police officers came and twisted his neck in a way. The neck, twisting his neck forced him to put one of his legs up. The leg hit the policeman, who now has part of the citation, was, I don't know, 3rd-degree assault or some minor form of assault. And he told me this story very calmly. I asked, it happened in May, I asked how he was doing. He said he was pretty much recovered from it. He didn't have any continuing injuries, but he had a lawyer and there would be a civil case as well. And as I went home and I knew that I was going to have this opportunity to speak with you this morning, I thought about his story. And the insight that I share with you is not to fault the policeman. and not simply to take Andre's side of the story, but to ask, how do we think human beings are going to behave if they are routinely exposed to violence, and dealing with violence is part of their everyday work? Won't they, like Nietzsche said of the hammer, to a hammer, everything is a nail? And so, do we put the citizens who are to defend us, as policemen are, in a position where they are so acclimated to the expectation of violence that they are predisposed to act in a violent fashion? And oh, is anyone surprised that Andre is black? And if that is part of what happens to policemen placed in violence repeatedly, should we be surprised that so many men and women in the military suffer trauma after that experience? There's one other thing before I leave this idea of public health, which is Bob Johansen, I believe, is a political scientist by training. Is that right, John? You're in international affairs. Is a now retired professor at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at Notre Dame. And he makes this interesting connection between peace studies and medicine in terms of it being preventive. That the more we study about the contributing factors that create conflict shifting into violence, that we can act in ways that prevent it. I think we all agree that it's better to prevent disease than simply wait till it's taken its course and intercede at that point. We believe in wellness care, right? And routine visits to doctors and dentists. That will be better in the long run. But peace studies doesn't, even if it has, as I believe it does, this preventive possibility, it isn't supported or understood in the same way as medicine is, as preventive. And there's one other thing that I'll say about this comparison. Does anyone think that cancer research has been wasted and should stop because it has not cured all forms of cancer? Does anyone believe that that's a waste? Or do we realize that progress is slow and that might exist in some corners more than others, and that we will continue working towards some eventual cure? I think we accept that incremental progress is better than none. And so, analogously, if peace studies does not stop all violence on a micro or a meso or macro level, does not mean that it is not beneficial. And it does not mean that it's not contributed by diminishing or preventing some violence. The demise of war. We're going to talk at lunchtime. We're going to hear from John Mueller, and he has a question mark. I forgot to put the question mark there. And I'll just share a couple of quick images. I'm looking at the clock. This is the famous dome at Hiroshima that was the target, basically, where the two rivers converged for the bomb at Hiroshima. And here's a peace sign that's made. It exists at a children's memorial there. Each of these little points is the end of a crane. There's that Japanese story of, if you have create 1,000 cranes, you'll get your wish. And so these two objects of children and the unrefurbished dome of this building exist within 100 yards, 200 yards of each other. And the point of the Peace Park, the focus of the Peace Park in Hiroshima, is not retribution, is not that we hate what happened to us, but rather that we believe it must never happen again to anyone else. And of course, that language of never happening again is one that many of our Jewish friends use in relation to their Holocaust. Here's an example I showed you of the 60 years that have shifted between the first Nobel Peace Prize and Martin Luther King with civil rights. For me, this is another example. When we talk about peace, and if we think about the State Department and diplomats and Hillary Clinton, we have images of foreign embassies, of visas and passports, of interceding when diplomats are killed, as just happened in Libya, of the large scale of international relations and trade treaties in various forms. But in addition, part of U.S. foreign policy now includes the education of women. And I think you can see how that too is integral to creating a more peaceful and less violent world. There are a variety of factors that you can isolate and identify that contribute to war by nations. Lack of transparency of government is one of them. Huge inequality of resources is a second. And disparities in access to education for women is a third, among a variety of others. So isn't it reassuring to know, for me at least, that from Martin Luther King talking about the most violent nation on earth in 1967, we now have as part of our policy under Secretary Clinton, the promotion of education of women internationally as an aspect of American foreign policy. Here's a little cartoon about the experts. I'm going to just share a couple of real quick factual studies done. The first, it's very hard to see. It's by a book by Chenoweth and Stephan, Maria Stephan. And you can certainly see in my dark handwriting, Why Civil Resistance Works Strategies, a Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict. And in this book, they look at a whole history of conflicts, and you can see that in this column, some failed, some succeeded, but their basic conclusion that purely from a strategic point of view, the use of nonviolence is more successful in achieving objectives than the use of violence. And one of the reasons for that is the ease, the relative ease of recruiting large numbers of participants to take part in the nonviolent action. It's a very, very interesting book. And Chenoweth in particular started it with great skepticism and didn't believe that they would end up with the results that they did. This is Steve Pinker's book. He'll be at Kentucky Authors Forum 1st of October, and looks at violence on a wide range of scales, from personal violence and rape, including international and civil conflicts. And the basic direction of this graph, you can see, is the diminishing frequency of state and civil wars from 1950 to the present. And I think we'll hear some more about that from John Mueller this afternoon. I'm going to skip a couple here in the interest of time. I'll point out that our current U.S. anti-terrorism policy, which then General Petraeus, now the head of the CIA, helped to author, has as a central core of it the very idea of winning hearts and minds. Some of you may know that film about the Vietnam War called Hearts and Minds. Winning hearts and minds is a different terrorism policy than killing the suckers. Winning hearts and minds is basically a nonviolent strategy. And it's not only the U.S. that's used it, it's been used in Vietnam as well, in the southern regions where Muslim and Buddhist populations have tension. We're going to hear from Melinda Leonard later today about Northern Ireland. And I'll just point out that this row of graves was created in Derry and is intended for victims. All of the grave sites were purchased by the IRA to create special places of honor for those who fell in the Troubles. I'm going to skip ahead in the interest of time through a whole bunch of slides to why peace studies and why here and why now. So is this lady's name, and she was a guide while I was walking in Vietnam. She's in the Hmong costumes, clothing, and I asked her what communism was. This was in 2008, I think. I asked her what communism was. She had no idea. She had never heard the term. And we spent a formative part of my time in college fighting a nation that included her parents who had no idea what the concept of communism might be. And in terms of justice, here we have a picture, the only time I ever wanted my picture taken with a famous person. Muhammad Ali claimed to be a conscientious objector, refused induction, and the next day, before he was indicted, before he was tried, lost his license to box and his ability to make a living. So much for innocent until proven guilty. So specifically here at Peace Studies, no, we're not trying to get rid of what I call Tyrannosaurus cardinalis and turn them into peace stout. But what we are doing is looking at this omnidisciplinary, this very broad base that includes all of these colleges and units and allies that I like to refer to. There are 140 courses in the departments that you see listed here that are included as an elective in this program that also has 3 requirements. Here are the 3 courses that are required, a sort of general overview of peace, justice, and conflict transformation. A mediation skills course. Main reason that people leave employers is not benefits, it's not pay, it's not vacation days, it's conflict, either with their boss or a coworker. So developing mediation skills to listen better, to understand the dynamics of conflict is a skill that we think everyone can use every day of their lives. And then finally, a capstone course in service learning where people will go out into a local, national, or international peacemaking organizations. So that's the program that all it lacks is approval by the Board of Trustees. We've already have students in the pipeline. There's information in the lobby, and I hope you'll want to learn more. This symposium, this conference has been sponsored by the Liberal Studies Project, and I'm especially grateful to John Hale for suggesting it, for Jana Tajabayeva, who you met at the table coming in, for a whole cadre of people on a steering committee that helped organize it. Roger Payne, who does have a D in his name despite what the program says, Sharon LaRue, Joy Hart, Kate Fossil, and Nisha Gupta. And we actually received our first donation for this program since this school year began. The good old Grover Cleveland, I'm sure you all knew that, $1,000 from an anonymous donor. And we have some very nice and peaceful bankers who are willing to accept other contributions to get this program launched. Where do we go from here? Besides starting this program, I think thinking about the long term instead of the short, and emphasizing we instead of me. I'd love it the next time that I go on an airplane to have the flight attendants say, not only thank you, the servicemen and women, but do we have any elementary school teachers on board? Do we have any nursery school workers? Do we have any folks who are social workers or firemen that we want to congratulate for their service to the country? And where do we go is that every one of you should read this book by Chris Hedges. Whoops, wrong book. It's a simple series of questions and answers. One of my favorite Margaret Mead quotes. Not my favorite one, not one of them. And from Robert Coles, the child psychologist, still living and working. That service is a form of responding to the needs of the world. I'm not going to tell the parable because we've run out of time. Thank you for your attention this morning. I don't know if there are some questions. Our next session is due to start in 10 minutes. I know that some students might need to be going to other classes or something, but if there are any questions or responses, I'd be happy to hear what they are. It's always the brave person who dares to raise their hand the first time. Sharon's going to help me get that comment out.
You know something? I believe that this city needs a peace coalition.
Could you hear this lady's comment? What form would that take? What would it look like?
Well, it could be people who have been working to eradicate violence for years. It could be the people who worked on peace. It could be a process. People of different races, religions.
There is a Louisville Peace Action community.
Yeah, I know that. Yeah.
And there's
more actively involved.
There's also the Kentucky Alliance, and there are some organizations. But you're saying that you think there's a hole between them, among them. What form would it take? How would you get it
I'm
going?
not really sure, but I think we need to involve more young people.
Here they are.
Yeah.
How many people are here from Louisville? Originally. What do you think you could do to help make more peace in your community?
I think the main is getting more involved. So, I mean, definitely the peace studies that you go. That of interest for me.
So next year, if we celebrate, or when we celebrate the International Day of Peace, you'll bring 3 friends. Maybe? Hopefully. How about you, ma'am, in the back? Got a suggestion for us?
Well, along the same line of having like a peace corps group, I kind of like the idea of an ambassadors program that would take people from different parts of the community and kind of exchange roles. I think sometimes that there's a tendency to the people, our communities, into categories and label them, but I think there's also an opportunity to change mindsets by having people come and actually stay in a community and see that all the negative impressions that are out there are not necessarily accurate. It's just a thought.
Part of mediation training is cross-cultural communication. I mean, that's one little piece of how we see each other. We tend to, want to see each other by shapes and skin colors and genders, and it's hard to get past the visual because people make such a strong impression on one another visually. Yeah. Hello, Stacy. Should I tell you my parable? Yeah. I know that it's easy for you to see in terms of visuals that I am an old man, or on my way to becoming an old man, but I am not an old Cherokee, and this is an image of an old Cherokee. And when I hear the word Cherokee, I think of the Trail of Tears, which of course is an example in our history of perpetrating violence on other people. But This Cherokee is a grandfather and a man who has many grandchildren, and they're gathered around him, and he says to them, a fight is going on inside of me, and it's going on inside of you, and you, and you, and you. It's a fight between two wolves, he says. Oh, grandfather, said the grandchildren, what are the wolves like? Who are the wolves? And he says, well, one of the wolves is fear and anger and greed, selfishness, hatred, and violence. The other wolf is generosity, thoughtfulness, kindness, care for one another. And these two wolves just go at it every day. They fight inside of me, and they fight inside of you, grandson, and you, granddaughter, and you, and everyone else as well. And you must be aware of this fight between these two wolves. And the grandfather started to leave, but the children said, that doesn't seem like the end of the story, grandfather. What happened? What are the wolves' names? Who wins in this struggle? So he comes back and he says to them, oh, well, I thought that was kind of obvious, children. The wolf that wins is the wolf we feed. Thank you.